Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service on this Thursday, November 3rd. We have a lot to talk about, but if you'd like additional weather information on top of what I provide each evening, you can go to weather.gov. That is the National Weather Service's online presence. It'll bring you to a map of the continental U.S. with Alaska and Hawaii in the lower left, and it's interactive. By pointing and clicking, you can bring up forecast and any relevant watches, warnings, or advisories that are in effect for anywhere in the country. Looking at the map this afternoon, once again, we've seen record high temperatures in the 70s across areas of the nation's midsection. That warmth is going to shift eastward over the eastern third of the United States as we go into this weekend and next week. Cold air has settled into the western states, particularly the northern Rockies, back into the Pacific Northwest and areas of California. As a result, we've seen winter weather advisories and winter storm warnings in especially the mountainous areas of the West and Pacific Northwest. But here in Alaska, we're seeing early taste of winter. The pattern is going to hold here for a little longer, and we have a pretty impressive weather system, a strong Arctic high pressure area that's going to be sliding across the east side of the state into northwest Canada later on this weekend. In the meantime, we still have some winter weather advisories and winter storm warnings in effect for areas of east central interior and along the west coast. As I mentioned, this big Arctic high pressure is going to be dropping southeastward and produce some strong outflow gap winds, especially along southern areas of the state and some of the areas along the northern and especially northeastern Gulf Coast and parts of the Panhandle, along with the potential for record cold temperatures in the Panhandle this weekend. High temperatures in some areas may not get much out of the teens or 20s. Now, we are expecting temperatures to moderate along the west coast later this weekend, Sunday into Tuesday of next week, but with it, a couple of weather systems will bring windy and a more stormy pattern to that area here as we, as I said, get into Sunday and Monday and Tuesday of next week. Looking at the FAA webcams this afternoon, Fort Yukon's reporting some light snow where there's still winter weather advisory in effect there until Friday morning. Total snow accumulations on the order of 3 to 4 inches, and then Shishmaref there on the north side of the Seward Peninsula has windy conditions, winds gusting upwards of 30-35 miles an hour. There's a high surf advisory as well as a winter weather advisory. Temperature there this afternoon only 25. Anchorage area, Merrill Field looking westward toward downtown, and Cook Inlet. The snow has ended. Anywhere from 3 to 6 inches of snow fell generally in the Anchorage Bowl last night into this morning, and areas along hillside picked up as much as 6 to near 9 inches of snow, but the snow has ended for now. And then along the northeastern Gulf Coast, we're seeing some breaks in the clouds. Yakutat temperature at 37, and as those pressure gradient does tighten up along the southern parts of the state, we're going to see brisk northeast winds as that Arctic high drops southeastward into the Yukon territory, and that's going to cause some very strong outflow gap winds there in places like upper Yakutat Bay, as well as, say, the Copper River Basin Delta could see some hurricane-force wind gusts with that particular setup when we have those strong pressure gradients. Well, here's the advisory and warning map, and we see the winter weather advisories continue. Tanana area, Lake Minchumina till 10 o'clock this evening, Fairbanks, Fort Yukon, Arctic Village into Friday morning, and some areas around the Alaska Range eastward toward the Canadian border will still have winter weather advisories till about noon on Friday. Heaviest snowfall is expected. Fairbanks down toward Northway, as much as 5 to 7 inches of snow there, with 3 to 4 inches expected around Fairbanks up toward Fort Yukon. Further west, we're looking at a winter storm warning that will continue in effect for the interior Seward Peninsula, including Buckland, the Buckland Highlands, for as much as 5 to 8 inches of snow, along with blowing, drifting conditions. And then we have the winter weather advisories and high surf advisories along the lower Chukchi coast from Point Hope down through Shishmaref, where northwest winds will gust 30-35 miles an hour, along with some lighter snow accumulations. And then as we go into Friday, there is a low coming out of the Anadyr Bay there off the Russian coast. That's going to bring some accumulating snows and a winter weather advisory here for Friday into Friday evening across areas of the Yukon River Basin, the lower Yukon River Basin, and the Delta during the day on Friday. And looking at the satellite imagery, we see 1 feet of moisture coming in off the North Pacific heading. It's passing toward British Columbia. Meanwhile, we still have a circulation located there in the northern Gulf. And then as you look out toward the northwest there's an area of enhanced clouds just east of Anadir, and that's heading southeastward. That's that next low that's going to develop. Not a real strong one, but it's going to have some moisture with it and enough dynamics to create accumulating snow there along the YK deltas, especially in there through parts of the lower Yukon and middle, say, Kuskokwim Basin as we go in the day on Friday. And other than that, here's the low this afternoon. Low pressure located over the north central Gulf. Occluded front along the coast there, British Columbia, Panhandle, and then a cold front extending south of the Alaska Peninsula. That trough that's currently working its way through the northern Bering will develop a low as it moves southeastward tonight. Low pressure coming in there to the Yukon Delta around Hooper Bay, that area, and that'll have with it some accumulating snows. And a weak area of low pressure will continue to sit up there around the northwest coast near Point Lay, and then the low out over the Gulf will try to work its way a little more eastward. And then on Friday afternoon, we'll see that low still kind of sitting just off the Panhandle coast, but the precipitation with that will have lightened and more showery in nature. And you'll begin to notice off to the northwest, there's a high pressure above the banner, the headline banner. That's the big high that's going to develop southeastward, the Arctic high. That will strengthen to above 1050 millibars here as we get into Saturday night and Sunday. Meanwhile, another frontal system off to the west there on the left side of your screen is going to be pushing eastward across the Bering, and that's going to help temperatures to moderate along the west coast while bringing windy conditions there later on this weekend. But you see the high by Saturday afternoon at 1047 high right along the spine of the Brooks Range heading southeastward into the central interior of the Yukon Territory. Notice the pressure gradient tightening there along south of the Alaska Range in through the Panhandle. We could see some gap winds developing there from Palmer Saturday afternoon and evening, and then spreading eastward in through those gaps, especially across the southeastern interior and coastal areas of the northern and northeastern Gulf into the Panhandle. That's going to lead to some much colder temperatures in the southeast as we go through the latter half of the weekend, early next week. So temperatures tonight generally above freezing, southern Panhandle, pretty chilly, interior areas single digits and teens of south central, and then still lower 40s along the outer west, southwest, and southern coastal areas there of the Panhandle, back up through the south central interiors, highs below freezing in the 20s. And then for Saturday morning, we could see some lows down around or a bit below zero, especially Copper River Basin. Otherwise, temperatures beginning to slip there into the teens and 20s in the northern Panhandle, and Saturday's highs up there toward Skagway, maybe only 26, so staying below freezing with winds increasing. And we see temperatures there 9 above for a high at Glen Allen. Across northern parts of the state, Friday morning, lows will be in the single digits, above and below zero. Areas along the Seward coast, mid-teens to near 20, including areas out towards St. Lawrence Island. Friday afternoon highs stuck there in the single digits along the Brooks Range, teens up through the middle upper Yukon Valley and along the Arctic coast. Generally low mid-20s, Seward Peninsula down and around Norton Sound. And then Saturday morning lows starting to get colder. Many sub-zero readings showing up there, and they'll be even colder than that. I imagine a few areas could be down near 30 below or so come Sunday morning there in the northeast as that big high takes shape and slides southeastward. High Saturday near zero there along the Brooks Range, Yukon Flats. Still holding up, though. Notice 34 at Savunga as a little warmer air is going to try and return to areas along the west coast Sunday into Monday and Tuesday of next week. So Friday morning lows for the southwest interior only in the teens at places like Bethel on up toward Anvik, and single digits at McGrath, but the outer coast 20s, and as we go down the Alaska Peninsula, lows generally above freezing freezing. Friday's highs still get back up around or just a tad above freezing along the Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays, 40s out through the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, and then Saturday morning lows, single digits as you go up the Yukon River and the upper Kuskokwim Basin, teens most elsewhere in the southwest, and then lows generally above freezing through the southern tip there of the Alaska Peninsula back out across the Aleutians, and temperatures on Saturday afternoon should generally make the lower and mid-40s through the Aleutians, and teens and lower 20s as you go up the Yukon River. And most importantly, temperatures will be warming on the west side of the state, breezier conditions later this weekend into next week, continued cold in the southeast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Let's take a look now at your aviation weather. If you have a flight planned either Friday or into the course of this weekend, we're going to start out with a few areas of low pressure. One weak area of low pressure along the northwestern Arctic coast, lower Chukchi Sea. Another in southwest areas, the lower half of the Kuskokwim River Basin, west side of the Alaska Range, and another out over the northeastern Gulf. The low that's located in the southwest is going to translate its energy eastward into the Gulf, and with it we expect potential for some IFR conditions along the lower half of the Alaska Range there up down into the northern portion of the Alaska Peninsula. Otherwise, we're not looking for any widespread IFR conditions across the state this time around. More interestingly, as we go through the weekend, though, we're going to be watching a very strong Arctic high pressure build across the northeast into the central Yukon territory Saturday night into Sunday. But before then, we can see a lot of VFR and just pockets of MVFR across the mainland and into areas of the Panhandle. Saturday afternoon, we expect general VFR conditions across much of the mainland and Panhandle. Some MVFR there, the eastern bearing along the west coast. And then by, as I said, Saturday night into Sunday, the strong high is going to increase the pressure gradient, especially south of the Alaska Range, along the northern and northeastern Gulf Coast into the northern Panhandle, and there are going to be some very strong outflow gap winds develop with that later this weekend. In the meantime, Anativik Pass IFR becoming VFR on Friday. Same thing at Adigan Pass IFR in the morning becoming VFR. And Lake Clark and Merrill further south and west along the west arm of the Alaska Range. Generally, IFR conditions should hold on Friday. Rainy Pass IFR in the morning giving way to MVFR conditions. And same thing, Windy Pass. You'll see IFR giving way to MVFR with IFR conditions generally just north of the north entrance and improving conditions becoming VFR there, the south entrance southward. Isabel Pass, generally MVFR conditions, but north there of the north entrance, IFR conditions giving way to MVFR conditions. Same thing, Metasta Pass, generally MVFR conditions expected Friday, but IFR conditions should give way to MVFR conditions there north of the north entrance. Tanita Pass, MVFR conditions becoming a VFR, and right now Portage looks like generally VFR conditions should prevail on Friday. Chilkoot and White in the far northern Panhandle start out Friday IFR, but give way to MVFR conditions. And freezing levels, we have the surface freezing line down along the southwestern coast, the YK deltas into the northern portion of the Alaska Peninsula, along the Kodiak Island and Kenai Peninsula coast, the northern and northeastern Gulf Coast, into the inner channels of the Panhandle. Overall, pretty cold air across the state. And the threat for icing, general isolated moderate icing possible in areas of the Panhandle as well as along the west into the Alaska Peninsula. Above 2,000 to 4,000 feet in the southeast, above 2,000 feet there in the southwest, in areas of some light snow and snow showers, and then up there along the Chukchi Sea, areas of the Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue Sound, we're looking at surface to 6,000 feet and some of the cloud cover that's out there. Jet stream level winds are fairly strong there in the North Pacific, south of the Alaska, Gulf of Alaska, upwards of 150 to 175 knot jet max, and then out over the eastern bearing, we're looking at winds upwards to 130 knots from the northwest, bringing it down to 9,000 feet or 700 millibars. We see the strong winds out coming in through the Alaska Peninsula off of Bristol Bay and into areas of the Western Gulf, 60 to 70 knots. Another area of 55 to 75 knots way out in the far western Aleutians. And then finally Friday we bring it down to 3,000 feet. Strong winds ripping across areas of the Bristol Bay into the Alaska Peninsula near Kodiak Island, out over the Gulf, North Pacific interface, 50 to 55 knots from the northwest. And then broad band of strong winds, 65 to near 80 knots there out from the southwest there in through the western Aleutians. Most importantly, turbulence. We could see isolated severe turbulence there in through Kamishak Bay, the entrance of Cook Inlet, as well as along the middle Alaska Peninsula and near and south of Kodiak Island, surface to 4,000, surface to 6,000 feet due to those strong west-northwesterly winds. And as I mentioned, with that Arctic high building and becoming strong later Saturday into Sunday, we could see some very strong outflow and gap winds from areas of Palmer eastward, especially into the northern panhandle later this weekend.
Trace here, Star Spires. Let's keep these spooky feelings going by finding the god of war, a red giant, and a nebulous sword all in a row. Hit the darkness around 12:30 and look east. Orion's 3 belt stars are easy to spot, as is his handsome hourglass figure. If you look directly above his club, the bright orange dot, that's Mars, named for the Roman god of war. Moving back down to Orion, the top left star in his constellation is Betelgeuse, a red giant 10 times more massive than our sun. Just don't say its name 3 times. Continuing toward the horizon, look just below and to the right of Orion's belt. That's Orion's sword. There you will find the Orion Nebula, one of the brightest in the night sky, likely brighter now than at any time in history, as it wasn't mentioned by ancient astronomers. Spooky. Bonus, Jupiter and Saturn are out tonight too in the southwest. Happy haunting, and keep looking up.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and joining me once again is Cindy Preller. She is the Tsunami Program Manager for the National Weather Service in Alaska region. Thanks for joining us again, Cindy.
Thank you, Dave.
We're talking about tsunami awareness and safety here in Alaska especially, and one of the things that has been one of your main focuses is the Tsunami Ready program. What is that, and how do Alaskans find out more?
Awesome. Yeah, Tsunami Ready is a National Weather Service hosted program in partnership with Storm Ready.
Okay.
And it is a program that we conduct with our partners in the state, but it's mostly community driven. So if a community wants to become Tsunami Ready, well, the first thing they need to do is get a hold of me or their local WCM at a weather forecast office or their tsunami team at the state level.
So, and this is something that's a NOAA grant, so there's money available to help encourage the preparedness at the local level there in the city or the village.
Yeah.
What are some of the places that have done this already?
Oh, our oldest Tsunami Ready city is Seward.
Good.
You know, but also Sitka, Homer, Valdez are the the main players. But we've got several Tsunami Ready communities that I'm very proud of. It takes several years to accomplish this, and so a few of the things that they do is the tsunami risk will be assessed by someone like me or another scientist. Will help find out really what their probability is. We'll create an inundation map, an evacuation map. They'll have a mitigation plan. We will set up some partnerships with the schools, make an evacuation shelter, and then they need to practice. But it is the city that owns the program, really. It's up to them. And many cities would like to have sirens, and so we help them get those. And and they practice. They have to practice.
Sure. So let's say I'm driving into a place like Seward that's tsunami ready. What are some of the things I should look for as maybe a visitor so I know maybe where I need to go or can be more aware of my tsunami risk?
Absolutely. The Tsunami Ready signage is really blatant. It's this blue and white curling wave sign, and there's different shapes of signs that'll show you if you are in the hazard zone or where the evacuation routes are and when you're out of shelter.
Okay. So this is a multi-step process that helps the residents be more aware of their own risk, but then also prepare for when that risk arrives.
Absolutely, absolutely. And many communities sound their sirens daily. Some sound them weekly, to make sure everybody knows what they mean. And there's often drills. We have an annual drill once a year. We have Tsunami Awareness Preparedness Week, and that's a good time for each community to do some exercising.
Okay. And is this a program that is unique to Alaska?
Absolutely not. It's national.
Okay.
And all over the country, you'll have the same signage, so it's consistent.
Good. So if I'm taking the kids to California, I should be able to see something familiar.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And, some communities hesitate because they think it'll discourage tourism. And so I would like to tell those communities that what they're actually doing is they're encouraging responsibility.
Sure.
The tsunami's going to happen.
Right.
And it's going to hit every coastline. So, it's not about when. It'll be any time. So the fact that they're showing tourists that they are making steps to be prepared for this, I think, would encourage people to want to stay there.
Right, and that would be no different than, say, you or I visiting the Midwest, where we know there's going to be really bad thunderstorms and maybe there's a risk for tornadoes. We're aware of that risk when we go there.
Absolutely. If I see a sign for a tornado shelter, I'm going to remember that.
Right. Okay. All right. So we're just doing a better job of being more prepared with something that's bound to happen again.
I hope so.
Okay. Very good. Where can people go again to learn more about the Tsunami Ready program here in Alaska?
Well, there is a Tsunami Ready website. So, just Tsunami Ready,
Google
and that'll
Tsunami
get you there.
Okay.
And then probably the best person for people to contact is their warning coordination meteorologist at their local weather forecast office, which is Anchorage or Juneau, most likely.
Okay. All right. So most of the folks along the Bering Sea coast, again, are not at a huge risk for tsunamis.
No, they don't need to worry about it.
Okay.
Thank
Very
you.
good. But always learning to be prepared no matter where you are in Alaska, no matter what the risk, always a good step. And tsunami is a major player in that, as we well know from events like 1964. Okay.
Alaskans are resilient. I really believe in them.
Very good, very good. Well, Cindy, thank you so much for joining us again, and please make an effort to learn more about the Tsunami Ready program in your village and town if you haven't already. We'll be back with Cindy again next time to talk more about the Tsunami Warning Center in Palmer, Alaska. We actually have a group of geologists working for the National Weather Service, so scratch your head on that one, and we'll join you next time. I'll see you next time on Alaska Weather Packs.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Let's close out the show now with the marine weather forecast, and first a check with the sea ice edge. Today, ice continues to expand across the Arctic coast and down along the Chukchi Sea coastline, including Kotzebue Sound and then down into Norton Sound. Further south, the ice is also building along the Yukon and Kuskokwim River deltas and expanding there in the southwest. Also, a little bit of ice showing up in areas of Cook Inlet, including Turnagain Arm. But the main weather story coming into Friday and Saturday and through the Panhandle will be some stronger winds and much colder temperatures. Could be looking at some record cold temperatures there across the Panhandle here as we go through the weekend. And to bring in that cold air, initially south winds 15 to 25 knots through the lower half of the inner channels there, with waves of 5 to as high as 9 feet toward Dixon Entrance, 8 feet with north winds to 40 knots. Lynn Canal, a hint of things to come. Strongest winds on the outer coast will be south of Sitka, 30 to 35 knot gales and waves 20 to 24 feet. On Saturday, look at the winds settling in up there across northern areas where Lynn Canal, 55 knot north winds with waves building to 10 feet. The outflow gap winds coming in there south of Gustavus, 50 knots with gusts to 65 knots, and also there in Yakutat Bay, especially upper Yakutat Bay, we'll see some very strong gusty winds and waves along the outer coast running anywhere from around 15 to 20 feet. For the northwestern Gulf, strongest winds on Friday will be there at the entrance of Cook Inlet, 45 to 50 knot northwesterly winds, waves 14 to 17 feet. We'll also see some stronger gap winds coming out of the Copper River Basin. Could cause some gusts upwards to 50 knots from the north, and in Prince William Sound, northwest winds to 35 knots, waves 8 feet. On Saturday, continue to see a cold northerly flow across the west side of the Gulf and south central areas. Winds 20 knots, upper Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound, waves 4 feet or so. Still the strongest winds coming out of the Cook Inlet entrance at 45 to 50 knots, waves 11 to 14 feet. Across Kodiak Island areas on the North Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, 40 to 45 knot winds with some gust upwards to 55 knots out of some of the gaps with waves of 10 to 15 feet. In through the southeast corner of the Bering Sea, Bristol Bay, 40 to 45 knot westerly gales, waves running 12 to 15 feet. And then on Saturday, winds Shelikof Strait northwest to 50 knots, waves 15 feet. Around and south of Kodiak Island and east of Chiknik, 45 knot northwesterly gales, waves 16 to 19 feet. And then in through the southeastern Bering there on the north side of the Alaska Peninsula, winds north 25 to 30 knots, waves 8 to 10 feet. Across the Aleutians, winds will be westerly 25 knots in the eastern Aleutians, kind of falling off through the mid-Aleutians and then picking back up to 40 knots from the south Kiska westward. And those winds will continue to build on Saturday. Upwards of 50 to 55 knot storm force winds near and west of Nikolsky. And overall, just looking at east to southeast winds increasing across the Aleutians, waves running as high as, say 18 to 26 feet on the North Pacific side and 8 to 15 feet on the Bering side. Along the southwest coast, winds will be northwest to west. Strongest winds there just west of Kuskokwim Bay to 40 knots with waves of 13 feet. Winds in Norton Sound northwesterly 50 knots, waves 3 feet. And then going into Saturday, winds will continue northwesterly around 10 knots in Norton Sound with waves a few feet, but winds will begin to turn back to the south and increase 25 to 30 knots as we get into the eastern Bering, especially vicinity of St. Matthew down to St. Paul with waves as high as 18 feet there around St. Matthew. Along the Arctic coast, winds generally out of the northeast to east around 20 knots, waves 4 feet or so where there is some open water outside of the ice there. And then winds will be easterly turning to the northwest as you pass through the Bering Strait and increasing to 25 knots with waves 6 to 8 feet down through that area. And on Saturday, winds will generally be out of the east along the Arctic coast as high as 25 knots at Kaktovik and waves running a few feet where you do have some open water. Through the lower Chukchi Sea from Point Ley down to the north side of the Seward Peninsula, look for southeast to east winds 15 to 20 knots, but turning southerly, increasing to 30 knots south of the Bering Strait with waves running 6 to 8 feet north of St. Lawrence Island. And later tonight into early Friday morning, we'll see low pressure pushing into the southwest areas, the Yukon, lower Yukon Delta with accumulating snows. And then later in the weekend, big Arctic high will be settling in to northern areas of the state, heading toward the Yukon by Sunday.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.